there is quite an overlap between ADHD and complex trauma. There is quite a symptom overlap. And you could still have both, but there is a huge overlap that can make it challenging to discern which one it is. And this is why a lot of kids can be experiencing trauma in their homes, having developmental trauma and get diagnosed with ADHD because they look similar to someone with ADHD but don't actually have it. Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self-Loved Woman podcast. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're going to talk about a really important topic, maybe a sensitive topic, that impacts so many ADHDers, and it's trauma and ADHD. So there's lots of different pieces to this. There's a deeper piece that a lot of people don't talk about that we'll get to at the end, and that we'll delve into more in my upcoming 3-part training, which there's information in the show notes about that. I'll also mention more at the end of this episode. But today we're going to have a little bit of a taste of that, as well as talk first a little bit more about ADHD and complex trauma. Before we dive into that, in case you're like new to me and you're thinking, who is this woman to be able to talk about this topic? Well, I want to just share that I'm a 50-year-old woman with ADHD. I was assessed at age 29, but not diagnosed because I quote unquote functioned too well. But I clearly have it. And when I read my old notes about it, it was clear that I have it. It's just that I was spending 2 or 3 hours a day functioning, doing things to help me function better. So I have that experience as well as working with women with ADHD, both in private practice and in my business. And I have been a trauma-focused therapist since 2014, meaning I did my EMDR training. I got certified in trauma center, trauma-sensitive yoga. That's the yoga that Bessel van der Kolk mentioned in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, that he studied. And I also am level 2 trained in IFS, with my level 2 training focusing on IFS for complex trauma. So I have a lot of training and experience in the topic of trauma, as well as experience and lived experience with ADHD. And so I really love how these things come together, but also have missed some important pieces along the way that I want to really speak to. Because as someone with expertise in this field, especially complex trauma, there were times when I missed ADHD because of it. So let's dig in. First, I want to share that ADHD and trauma, or PTSD, as diagnostically we would often refer to it if people meet criteria, and that's a whole nother thing, because you can still have a trauma history that impacts you today and just not meet criteria for a diagnosis, but that doesn't mean it doesn't cause problems in your life. But that's a whole nother topic. You've heard me rant and rave about the DSM before, so I'll leave that for another time. But what I will say is that these two disorders, or I want to use the air quotes around the word disorder, co-occur quite commonly. And the thing is I don't even know that we know how much they co-occur. I've seen between 12 and 37%. That seems really low to me, actually. And I think that any estimate that we get right now from data is probably going to be off. And I think that for a few reasons. One, I think diagnosis, people often are missed when they have ADHD, but they have trauma, and so ADHD is ruled out. Or the other thing can happen: when they were kids, they were diagnosed with ADHD when in reality it was complex trauma. And the other thing to consider is that the diagnostic criteria for all the disorders in the DSM were normed off of cisgendered men. And so a lot of people who have ADHD, like me and possibly yourself, are not included in those numbers because we were never diagnosed, we were misdiagnosed, we were late diagnosed. And so I feel like those numbers are way, way off in terms of people who have ADHD and also have trauma. But my point is that there is a relatively high number, I would say, of people who have both. And we're going to get into two main reasons why that is. One, and we'll start here, this is the thing that's maybe more talked about, is there is quite an overlap between ADHD and complex trauma. There is quite a symptom overlap. And you could still have both, but there is a huge overlap that can make it challenging to discern which one it is. And this is why a lot of kids can be experiencing trauma in their homes, having developmental trauma and get diagnosed with ADHD because they look similar to someone with ADHD but don't actually have it. This is also why when I was, this was just like 5 years ago, specializing in complex trauma, as a clinical social worker, we don't do assessments for things like ADHD because that's much more involved than a diagnosis of like depression. And so I was always told as a trauma therapist to be very careful with telling people they have ADHD because it can look so much like trauma, or trauma can look like it, that you can end up, with someone being misdiagnosed, that I overcorrected and would often just be like, no, that's your trauma, that's your trauma, that's your trauma. And hey, I'll admit that wasn't the greatest, right? I've since course corrected, especially as I've come in to realize what ADHD looks like in women in the last 5 years, and really been honest with my own self about my own ADHD, going back and reading the actual document that was written from my assessment, which I thought said I don't have it. It didn't exactly say that. It said you don't meet criteria because you function too well, which is not the same thing, right? So I want to name that a lot of times, because of this overlap, people can get misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. And that's really important to recognize. And some people can have both and it'll get missed. Like I said, a lot of the symptoms overlap. So here's some things that ADHD and PTSD have in common. So high burnout, that's right away, which if you think about with complex trauma, you're hypervigilant, you're always aware of what's going on, trying to keep yourself safe, in that fight or flight response. Of course, there's going to be a high level of burnout. And with ADHD, you're working so hard just to function. Yeah, burnout. I mean, do I need to explain that one? And so that makes a lot of sense. Along with that can come overwhelm and high anxiety or panic. And again, with ADHD, you can feel overwhelmed, have all these things to do on top of just getting yourself to function. And doing it in this neurotypical world can feel so much more challenging, and it can be anxiety provoking, not to mention, I don't know about you, but for years, I was trying to not be put down for my ADHD or have people be frustrated with me, right? I was masking. And so that in and of itself can contribute to anxiety. Like, oh, I can't let people see that, or don't interrupt, don't interrupt, don't interrupt, right? Like over and over, or like I would put my hand over my mouth to make sure I wouldn't interrupt someone. And remembering to ask questions of other people, which for people who don't have ADHD and are listening, it's not that we don't care about you. It's just that we're in our own minds that go so fast. Sometimes we forget to take a breath and realize like, oh, yeah, I actually want to ask a question to this person because I'm interested in what they have to say. That's why I'm here. But we can get so wrapped up in our thoughts that we sometimes forget. So this panic, anxiety, overwhelm all makes sense because we're trying to function in this neurotypical world. And if you have PTSD, also the same, you're trying to stay safe in a world that doesn't feel safe to you anymore. Another thing that both people with PTSD and people with ADHD have is what is called executive dysfunction. And now I think you know how I feel about this. I'm not a huge fan of the word dysfunction because who says it's dysfunctional? What if our brain is the one that works better? Right? And I think it's dysfunctional in the neurotypical world. But if we can find a way to create a life, a business, and a way of being that works with our ADHD, and we allow our ADHD brain to be the way it is, and it functions well that way, does that mean we're dysfunctional then? And so you know how I feel about that. But it's called executive dysfunction because it is not the way that people think it should be. You know my beef there. And I want to say The thing about executive dysfunction, we know that is core to ADHD. That our brains function different than a neurotypical brain is a core feature of ADHD. It's what contributes to so many of the other challenges that we face living in this neurotypical world. And so that is for sure a piece of it. In terms of the executive dysfunction and PTSD, that makes a lot of sense too, because if you're focused on safety and you don't feel safe, if you're living in a war zone, you're not going to be like functioning optimally because you're in your fight or flight response or shutdown response all the time. And as I've talked about in different episodes, when I get into the nervous system, when we are in our fight or flight or shutdown response, our protective responses, our body, our brain is only focused on survival. So everything else isn't going to go as well, which is why thinking, planning, learning, all those kind of things that require executive dysfunction don't go as well in people who have PTSD or who meet criteria for PTSD. Emotion dysregulation. That's obvious for people with PTSD. For sure, if you don't feel safe, you're going to get dysregulated emotionally more often because things that go on in the present are going to trigger you. And so you're going to be emotionally dysregulated. With ADHD, we can get emotionally dysregulated as well. Some of that has to do with our brain, but some of it has to do with the intense criticism we receive throughout our life. And we're going to talk about that towards the end of the podcast that has actually created some sensitivity for us. So we'll stay tuned for that. Listen to the end and you'll get that piece. Sensory sensitivities. So with ADHD, we have certain sensitivities because of how our brain is wired. And with PTSD, if you think about someone being in their fight or flight response, bright lights are going to be triggering for them. Certain noises are going to be triggering in closed spaces, right? There's going to be things that are going to be less tolerable. And so it will look very similar to each other. Both have issues with sleep disturbance. PTSD because of nightmares and flashbacks and not feeling safe. ADHD, we actually have I don't want to say a different circadian rhythm, but we don't feel like going to bed at the same time when neurotypical people do. It's just our brains like to stay up later. It's what they do. And I read this in a book, The ADHD Way or something like that, or How to Live with ADHD. And I was like, yes, that is so true. I see that in myself. I see that in all of my clients with ADHD. Our sleep is just different, right? And sometimes we can struggle to fall asleep because our thoughts go so fast. If we're not able to get them to quiet down enough to go to sleep, then we also can struggle with sleep disturbance. So ours isn't so much about a lack of safety, whereas PTSD it is, but this is just a piece of how they're similar. Okay, isolation. So you can imagine people with PTSD like to isolate, but it's actually common to isolate with ADHD. Now, why might that be? And my observation is that it can be overwhelming to interact with others because in order for them to accept us, especially if the others are neurotypical people, it can take a lot of energy to engage with them. When we're around other ADHD, it's more, I don't want to say it's necessarily relaxing. If you're an introvert, you might be drained from interaction, right? But it's easier. We just talk in circles together and what other people would call interrupt each other, right? But it's not interrupting, it's just adding to the conversation and sharing our experience, right? Whereas neurotypical people, when we interrupt and share our experience, they see it as interrupting and narcissistic because we're making it about us. Whereas ADHDers are like, oh my, get it, yes, right? So social interaction can be very exhausting for people with ADHD, especially when you're talking to people who have a neurotypical brain. So, in my mind, the reason why I isolate, at least when I do, and the reason I see other people in my work isolate is because social interaction can be overwhelming for us unless we're around other ADHDers. Something to think about. And again, if you're not feeling safe in the world with PTSD, you're going to isolate. I mean, that's just natural that you're not going to want to be out in the world because nowhere feels safe, maybe except your home, even if that. All right. Both have struggles with impulsivity. And with ADHD, that's a part of how our brain is wired. We struggle to pause and think things through. with PTSD, there can also be some impulsivity. What I've observed in that is more just like anything to stay safe, is where I see it coming from. There may be some other clinical things going on there, but that's what it seems because with PTSD, everything is about getting safe, survival. And so remember, because PTSD, as much as the D stands for disorder, I don't really like the word disorder in there either, because it's only considered a disorder because you are responding as though the trauma is still happening when in the present moment it's not. But the thing is we know that trauma is held in the body. And so there are parts of you that do think the trauma is still happening, that do think the trauma is present. So I'm not a big fan of the word disorder in PTSD, but that's what it's called. So I'll use it. But again, if you think about in the brain of someone with PTSD, nothing feels safe because it feels like the trauma is still happening. So, of course, you're going to isolate, especially if you have relational trauma where it involved other people harming you in some way or being exposed to people harming people. So, that isolation really makes sense that both groups would have it, but it's again for very different reasons. Distractedness. And with ADHD, I don't even think I have to explain that. We know that's just part of our wiring. But again, with PTSD, it's more about they're distracted because they're not focused on what's going on in the present. A lot of the parts of them are living in the past, trying to stay safe. And so it can be really hard to focus in the present. And that's similar for the restlessness. You'll see people, I used to work at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs, and the Army guys, you would see them, they like bounce their leg like crazy. They're just super restless in their chairs. I mean, particularly the ones with PTSD, because those are the ones I tended to see. But they're constantly moving and bouncing their leg. And it's not necessarily that they have ADHD. I mean, some of them may have had ADHD, but for them, there's a restlessness. There's a restlessness. And that makes sense when you consider that their body doesn't feel safe. If you've ever had a moment where you don't feel safe, you just want to get out of there. You know, like if you're walking down a dark street at night, you're like, I got to get out of here. And you're just like, woo, 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 walking as fast as you can. But if you're forced to sit in a chair in like a therapy group, which is what I ran, then you're going to bounce your leg because you're restless. Your body, it's not even a thought process. It's just your body just is moving because there's that fight or flight response that's going on there. Restlessness with ADHD is more about how our brains are wired. We need movement. We need movement. Movement helps us focus. For me, I've noticed, I mean, yeah, it helps with our baseline level of dopamine, which is important because in order to function optimally with ADHD, we want to have a strong baseline level of dopamine, and daily exercise, got to tell you, that's the silver bullet on that one. But it's not what we're here to talk about today. Maybe we can have another episode on that because I know the E word is like, puts some people into hives. So I get it. But having movement every day is really important for the ADHD brain. But getting our bodies to move is really, really important because otherwise we can feel restless. And even with that, we do because our nervous system is getting dysregulated. We're having a hard time focusing. And so if you can get out and move, even in moments of restlessness for like 5 minutes, you'll actually be able to focus better. Okay. The last one that both groups have is thrill seeking. I think we know why ADHDers are thrill seekers because the way that our brain processes dopamine and gets dopamine to move throughout our brain is not the same as people who are neurotypical. And it can be a little bit of a challenge. It's kind of a way to say it, not like we're doing it, but like it's hard for our brain to do. And so then we seek out things that are thrilling because that can spike our dopamine, which actually isn't great for our ADHD brain because whenever you spike your dopamine with high level things like thrill seeking, then you actually lower your baseline dopamine. So it can be harder to get yourself to focus and concentrate and all those kind of things when you have a lower baseline dopamine. So actually that thrill seeking, as much as it seems like it helps, it actually over the long run is not helpful. But it's something that we have in common with people who have PTSD. And if you've ever lived anywhere near a military installation, then you know that people with PTSD are thrill seekers. because you'll see the Army guys driving around with their motorcycles, no helmet, no protective gear, riding like bats out of hell, right? And doing other wild things that are pretty unsafe, but are thrill induced. They're seeking that thrill. And to be honest, I'm not really sure what that's about. I just know that they do it. And I don't know what I can guess is it might be trying to have a sense of mastery over, like, yes, this is scary, but I can control it. Right. So that's how that makes sense to me. There may be more of a clinical or neuroscientific reason behind that, but that's just what I witness as a trauma therapist. That is a long ass list of the things that ADHD and PTSD have in common. And so that is why diagnosis can get so tricky because there's such an overlap. It's very easy to diagnose someone with the wrong thing, or when they have both, to not see it. Because maybe, like me, like the way I used to be, I was being overly cautious. Not that I gave an ADHD diagnosis, but I was less likely to refer someone because I was like, well, it's probably your trauma. And I will say, there are some psychologists who will say, I recently referred someone for an assessment, and they did the assessment, and at the end of the assessment said, there's a good chance they have ADHD, but they've got so much complex trauma that I can't actually diagnose them till they've done more of their trauma healing. So that's where it gets really dicey because there is so much overlap, it's really hard to know. So I wanted to speak to that because it can be frustrating if you have ADHD and or complex trauma and you're trying to figure out what's going on or why are people misdiagnosing you. I wanted to share a little bit about that overlap and if you see yourself in that, right? There's a huge overlap there. So that is one way that ADHD and trauma intersect. But I want to talk about another bigger one that we're going to get into way more at my live event coming up starting August 1st, 2024, in case you're catching this next year. So that is that growing up with ADHD, especially if we're undiagnosed, but even if we're diagnosed, we received way more negative, critical, and corrective comments than our non-ADHD peers. There's actually a child psychiatrist out at Harvard, Michael Jelenic, and he conservatively estimates that by age 10, we received 20,000 more negative, critical, and corrective comments than our non-ADHD peers. And you've heard me say this, but it's a super conservative estimate because it's like it's when we start school to age 10. And if you do the math, I think it's 9 extra comments a day or 3 extra comments an hour or something like that, which is nothing. I mean, the number of times I was told to stop talking as a child, that was definitely more than once or twice an hour. Or to pay attention or not lose things or to clean my locker or my room, right? And I'm sure you're no different than me. So most of us ADHDers, especially women, because I want to say this, having a totally incomplete sentence, which, ADHD, right? But most of us women, because girls are expected to be the ones who have really good executive dysfunction, who are organized and have their shit together and stay on top of things and are respectful, like don't talk when other people are talking. That's what most people consider respectful, right? And so because that is what girls are expected to do, that's how we're socialized. When we don't with ADHD, we get even more crap about it. We get the criticism, negative comments, and corrective comments. So 3 extra an hour seems like a really low number, but he wanted to make a conservative estimate. But if you think about that, 20,000 more negative, critical, corrective comments by age 10. That's including the last, for me, 40 years of my life. And let me tell you, there was some there. I get a lot less now because of how I've designed my life and my businesses, but it still can happen, right? I also don't kind of care anymore at 50. I was listening to a podcast on perimenopause that was fantastic. And this person was interviewing a neuroscientist. And she was at the end of, towards the end of it, they were talking about some of the struggles, but then they were talking about some of the beauty of being postmenopausal and how it increases women's empathy. And there was a second one, but the third one was that by the time you've gone through perimenopause and you're in menopause, you have 0 Fs to give. Like literally no longer care about pretty much anything. And so I will say, I'm like, geez, I'm only 50. what's that going to look like once I'm postmenopausal? I mean, how could I care less than I do now? It's almost scary. But I care about humans and I care about people treating other humans well, but I just can't care about other people's opinions about me because I just don't have the energy for it. But anyway, I digress. Back on the rails. My point is that we have received so many negative and critical comments over the course of our life that basically told us that we were fundamentally flawed and that we were incapable, that we weren't doing it right, whatever. I mean, you name it. And to me, as a trauma therapist, I don't know how that couldn't be traumatizing for people. And maybe some people are like, "Sorry. Okay, great. How's your self worth? Are you able to go out on social media and really, really not care in your bones and in your heart if someone doesn't like it? Are you able to go out and do big things without being afraid of people saying, "Who does she think she is?" Right? And it's possible. You might be like, "Totally, Jen. I'm awesome. I love myself. Those people were wrong." Fantastic. But I think what is true for a lot of ADHD women entrepreneurs is that we struggle to put ourselves out there because we feel small. And if you don't want to use the word trauma, I got to believe on some level there's woundedness there. There's woundedness. And that unhealed trauma can interfere with our ability to really build that meaningful, prosperous business we want. The one that will give us the time freedom, the energy freedom, the way to work freedom, the money freedom to live the life we want. And so in my upcoming training, we're going to unpack this more. And I'm actually going to share a trauma healing strategy in that workshop that you can figure out how to practice on your own as well. I think it's important to really bring this up, even though we're going to delve in more later, because when we're talking about the crossover between ADHD and trauma, to not mention this feels remiss. So to me, it's like, how do we properly diagnose either when, first of all, there's overlap in the symptomatology or traits, whatever word you want to use there. But also, if a lot of people, at least growing up in our eras, if you're listening to this, were mistreated because of our ADHD, we're criticized, we're traumatized even because of our ADHD. So it's a really important topic, really something to think about as you're considering your own ADHD and even your own inner self-talk, right? If you catch yourself calling yourself a piece of shit or that was stupid or, even shame on you if you say shame on you, right? Like that was learned behavior from someone saying that to you. It's really important stuff to pay attention to, both just so you can have like a good life and not feel like crap for the rest of your life, but also because this gets in the way of you having the business you want. Because in order to have the business you want, you have to put yourself out there. You do. It's just how it is. You have to put yourself out there. And if you have a lot of these unhealed wounds and you haven't done any of the work, it's going to be really hard to do that. I'm not saying you have to be like a completely healed person or enlightened like the Buddha to be able to do this. So it's just that if there's something that it feels like inside that's stopping you, then it may be that you have to do more of this healing in order to be able to do the things you want to do for your business. So if you're not registered yet, I highly recommend you register for this really, I don't want to say like action packed, and I don't want to say intense, though I am intense because I have ADHD, but probably so are you. So there you go. Matchy, matchy. It's just a meaningful training where you're going to get so much insight about your experience as well as tools to help you be able to navigate ADHD and build your business. So I hope you'll register. The link is in the show notes, and I will see you there. Take care.